So welcome. It's so nice to see so many smiling faces this morning and so many people joining us. My name is Joe DeLong. I'm the Executive Director and CEO of the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities. And just really excited to be here and to have our panel discussion and to be able to communicate across so many different bright and community-based organizations. I want to share with you a little bit of background on CCM's involvement with ARPA, which a lot of, particularly even our members, are aware of the engagement that the organization has had in getting out guidelines and training and answering questions and working with the Treasury. But our real involvement with ARPA started way before then. It actually really kicked into high gear after the CARES Act funding was released. Everybody remember the CARES Act? Nobody even talks about the CARES Act anymore because everything's all about ARPA. Well, when CARES Act funding was released, we had a pretty good inclination in our conversations on the Hill in Washington that there was going to be a second round of CARES Act funding, which we now know as ARPA, but it was being referred to at that time as a second round of CARES Act funding. And one of the things that concerned us when the first round of CARES Act funding came to the states, other than the large cities, all of the rest of the funding went to the state with guidance from the Treasury. And the Treasury guidance said to the states that we would recommend that you spend 40% or allocate 40% of your CARES Act funding states that you received to your local and county governments. Connecticut did about 2.5%. And so we were already a little concerned. Our belief as an organization that represents local governments was that if that money could make it to the local level, that it reaches the people in a better way. But the other thing that was perhaps more concerning to us is because Connecticut does not have a functioning county government system, we are all local governments, we knew that the next round of funding was going to have monies that were dedicated directly to local governments because we weren't the only state that was complaining to Washington that the money was going to the state and not making its way down the way that it was intended. And so NACO, which is Association of County Officials, is a very large, powerful lobbying group in DC. We were certain we're going to make sure that there were funds allocated in that next round for county governments. What has historically happened in Connecticut, if money is allocated for county governments, we just don't get it because we don't have county governments. So we started a very aggressive lobbying effort that really took place before the Democrats took power in DC when the Republicans were still in power. We were meeting with Senator McConnell's office and others talking about if there is a county allocation, there should be a carve-out in there that says in Connecticut, the money that would have gone to counties needs to be prorated and needs to go to the cities and towns so we don't lose that funding. And we pretty much had, well, there wasn't bipartisan agreement on a new funding package, or there wasn't bipartisan agreement on the amount. We had pretty much gotten to the point where we had bipartisan agreement and support on that issue, on making sure that we didn't get left out. And what ended up happening was we were successful. There are a couple other states, not many, a couple other states that are in that same boat. We formed a little coalition, worked through the National League of Cities, made this a big issue for the National League of Cities. We were successful in getting them engaged, and it was literally the evening before the vote count was done. It was the evening of the special election in Georgia where the runoff races were taking place, that the head of the National League of Cities picked up the phone and called me and said, "You guys better be ready to go tomorrow." And I said, "Why? What are you thinking?" He said, "I think that the Democrats are going to win these seats in Georgia, and if they do, this is going to be a very quick-paced, off and running type of thing in Washington where this ARPA funding is going to be appropriated, and we want to make sure that we're right there in line to get it." So in the end, what ultimately happened, and a lot of people don't even realize this, is our non-entitlement communities in Connecticut, the local government funding that they get in most cases is actually less than the other pot of money that they received, which was their allocation of the county government funding. So there's municipal governments all across the country that are a little bit jealous of Connecticut because our municipal governments essentially in many cases got like double of what their peers in other states got because that pot of funding in other states went to those in county government. Now, I tell you all of that because I think there was also a commitment that took place in those conversations in DC. And that commitment was that we as an organization would really drive our members to understanding that when you get this extra money, this county allotment of funds, that you need to think of those more like you're a part of a county as opposed to just a town. That's what that money was for. That pot of money was for larger, more regional or higher scale type of opportunities. And so we continue to talk as much as we can to our communities about that, about looking and thinking big and thinking about this as being a historical opportunity to do things differently than we've ever done them before. I'll tell you that right after the ARPA funding was allocated, we had a meeting with the state executive office and the governor's office and others, and we're essentially in a nice way told, hey, you guys got a lot of money. You do what you need to do with your money. We'll do what we need to do with our money, which I had a real problem with, and I still do. It's all taxpayer money. It's all relief money. It's all money that needs to make it down to the communities. Our slogan for our organization at CCM is collaborating for the common good. And I think the more we can collaborate, the more we can share in our ability to allocate funding together, to target certain projects together, the more it's going to be felt in our communities in a positive way. So I'm just really grateful for all of you to be here today, to be a part of that conversation. I think that conversation, to be successful, has to be a two-way street. It can't be municipal governments going to the philanthropic community and saying, hey, here's all of our projects, will you help us support them? It can't be the philanthropic community going to municipal governments and saying, these are the things that we want to see done with the money, and if you do it, then we'll support it. I think that they have to work together and work in harmony and be open to having those communications, both on a small scale and on much larger scales. And I think that we have some of the people in this room that can help with doing that. So again, thanks for taking some time out here this morning. I'm really looking forward to this and appreciative of your time. And at this time, I'm going to call up my friend, next person to give some welcoming remarks, Jay Williams with the Hartford Foundation.
Thank you, Joe. Good morning. My remarks really echo what you've heard from Joe just a few minutes ago. Prior to arriving at the Hartford Foundation for public giving 5 years ago in a philanthropic leadership role, I spent 11 years in local government, both as an appointee and as elected official serving as the mayor of Youngstown, Ohio. I spent 6 years in the federal government in a variety of positions, and in between, during my local service, also worked very closely with state officials and served on some state commissions. And what I found throughout those many years was the common thread of philanthropy and the importance of collaborating with philanthropy. And what Joe said just as he departed really resonated with me, because the most impactful and effective outcomes that I've seen, that I've experienced, happened when you had individuals from each of those branches of government, whether they be federal, state, or local, understanding that they all play an important role. There are certain strengths and levers that they all bring, but there are also certain impediments. And to find and identify individuals, many of whom are in this room, who understand how to navigate most effectively, whether they're at the federal level, the state level, the local level, or in philanthropy. And then to be able to sit down and have conversations that are mutual in terms of understanding the ultimate interests that they have, the impediments and the limitations that exist on each of those levels. And there are limitations and impediments that exist, but ultimately trying to find a path that results in the highest and best use of the very limited resources that are at play here. And I think that when we think about a state like Connecticut, which I'm still relatively new to, that does not have county government, that has 169 municipalities and political subdivisions, it can be a challenge, but not one that is insurmountable. And that's where I think philanthropy can play an especially important role as that convener, as that ability to bring together what are sometimes disparate interests, and we won't overcome all the political hurdles, but I think to do that in a way that ultimately is most impactful, because these are unique times. I mean, it is unlikely that we will have an influx of federal resources to the level that we see now with a high degree of flexibility. If we do, it means that there's another crisis, and we would like not that to be the case for many, many years. But in this unique opportunity we have, the other important thing that has been very much of a priority for many of us in this room is ensuring that these funds are distributed and impactful in an equitable way. So often it's easy to say there's an influx of cash, we've got these priorities that have been sitting on a shelf for so many years, let's just fund as many of them as we can. Even if we fund them through a collaborative method, that's fine, but making sure that there's an equitable approach, because we have communities that have been underserved, overlooked for so many years. And by addressing those, it makes for a better outcome for the entirety of the region, the entirety of the state. So I'm excited about what we're going to hear, excited to see so many of you in person after so long, and particularly just on a personal note, excited. I mean, I'm sure we've all come to IKEA a bunch of times and have wondered what this building has been. And as I followed the history of this building, I didn't realize until probably 5 minutes out that this was the place that we were holding this. So also just happy to be here and see an adaptive reuse of this structure, and that we're able to make use of it today. So looking forward to the conversation, and thank you all for coming out. Sorry, Carl, I should have done more formal. I didn't realize.
No, that's great. Last but not least. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome. I am so glad to see so many familiar faces and so many new ones alongside them. I'm Carla Fortunato. I'm president of the Connecticut Council for Philanthropy, the state's association for grant makers who are working together to make for a better Connecticut. Our members, public and private foundations, corporate giving programs, and donors are working across the state on a range of issues, from preventing and addressing homelessness to welcoming returning citizens back into their communities, from supporting economic and community development to strengthening our workforce system. And they're working with nonprofit and other partners to make a bigger impact together. I've been working in this field for a number of years, and I know that when people hear philanthropic organizations, when they hear what I do for a living, they literally see dollar signs, and that makes a lot of sense. That's what philanthropy is certainly best known for. But they can bring a lot of other resources to the table, and I think we're going to hear a little bit about that today. They bring leadership, they bring knowledge and experience after working on issues for years and years. They remember lessons that have been learned over the last decade or more, what works and what doesn't. And finally, they can bring others along too. They can leverage their networks for technical expertise or other partners. They can raise the visibility of the issue to get more eyes on the challenge. Over the last couple of years, my members' interest in connecting with municipal leaders has been growing, especially during the lockdown. Philanthropic organizations wanted to know where their support was needed and how they could partner with towns and cities. And while we aren't locked down anymore, thank goodness, and it's so nice to be out and about, the collaboration interest is very much still there. And I hear about it all the time. Where are the best opportunities to partner with municipalities? What are communities experiencing on the ground? What do municipalities need to address these challenges? Where might we be helpful? How can we make sure that we're addressing the needs of everyone, and especially communities of color? I'm really excited to hear about the stories today of where this work is already happening, and to explore with all of you where there might be other opportunities to work for a bigger impact for Connecticut's residents by working together. So thanks so much for being here and for being part of the conversation. I'm going to turn it over now to Alyssa Gordon with the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving and invite the first round of panelists up. Thank you.
I think maybe closer in. I don't think it matters. There's only 4 of us.
See if I can get on this without falling off.
I know. I'm very grateful that I'm standing. So good morning. I am Alyssa Gordon. I'm Vice President of Community Impact at the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving. And I'm really glad to be with all of you here today in person to learn together with our panel of municipal and philanthropic leaders about how they are harnessing this unprecedented infusion of federal funds in our municipalities and the ways that they're working together with philanthropy to both recover and rebuild in ways that are, as Jay mentioned, are both equitable as well as sustainable. And before we begin with the panel, I just wanted to mention that when ARPA was announced last year, the Hartford Foundation decided to commission some research where we had folks go out and interview our municipal, our school district, leaders, as well as some of our community foundation peers across the country to better understand how our state, as well as the municipalities and school district leaders in our region, were planning to use their ARPA funds. And we learned that that we interviewed in our region, we learned that those towns were focused on grants, both directed as well as providing opportunities for competitive grants. And they were really focused in looking at infrastructure needs that were previously unattainable. They were looking at economic development. They were focused on supporting small businesses and nonprofits, particularly those that were led by women and people of color. They were focused on mental health services, particularly the school district leaders. And they were engaging with their local arts and culture community. We also learned that municipalities needed supports, even beyond the ARPA dollars, more flexible funding to monitor, to assess, and to achieve the outcomes that they sought to provide. And that nonprofits, in addition to programmatic dollars, were also talking about how they needed capacity building support so that they can make the best use of the ARPA dollars and to capture the learning in ways that would allow municipalities and the nonprofit to continue to obtain funding beyond the first round of ARPA funding. And many spoke about the ways that private philanthropic dollars could complement the ARPA fund in ways to provide technical expertise around grants management, in terms of program design and planning, evaluation and reporting. And some of the town leaders and school leaders talked to us about whether or not it was possible for philanthropy to hold and possibly safeguard some of the federal funds to allow more time for planning and to possibly even hold those dollars beyond the sunset period or the fiscal cliff period of the federal fund. So with that in mind, I'd like to introduce our panel, which are a little spread out, so I'll stand over here. Okay. To introduce our panelists who will be sharing their efforts about how they allocated their ARPA funding in their municipalities and the ways that they may be working with their philanthropic partners. So I can't see everybody's name tag, and I think we've all met by Zoom, but I may not get it in order. But I think we have John Solomon right next to me, City Manager of City of Norwich. All the way at the end, we have Miriam Alehai, who's the President and CEO of the Community Foundation of Eastern Connecticut. We have Jeff Caggiano, Mayor of the City of Bristol, and right in the middle, Jason Bowser, First Selectman Town of East Windsor. So I'd like to start us off by asking each panel, we can maybe start here with John, to take about 3 to 5 minutes to provide some highlights and overview of their ARPA-related efforts. And if you can, to also include in that commenting how you may be working with philanthropy as part of those efforts.
Thank you. Good morning to everybody. It's nice to be here in person. This is the first live presentation that I've made in about over 2 years. So I was a hermit for about 18 months, and I kind of slowly got out of my protective shell over the last few years. I thank the organizations that are sponsoring this program to invite me. And when you were giving the list of ARPA type of projects, I checked off the boxes mentally in mine, and we're doing those standard type of fundings, public works, capital projects, heavy into social services, human services as we call it. There was a great need for replacement income. We own our own utility system in Norwich, so we had a really good insight into problems of individuals not being able to pay their electric bill, their heating bill, and in essence, they were paying us, so we were losing the money on both ends of it with that, and it was a severe challenge. It's happening right now. In April, the moratorium, which the state has, which means you can't turn off power between November and April, that was put into place quite a few years ago because tragedies developed when utilities turned off power in January and people would freeze to death and whatever. So we affected that, and I think the ARPA funds to a large extent went to that. But there's one area that was a niche for us, and what I want to talk about for another couple of minutes, and that is our funds for our arts and cultural organizations within the city of Norwich, and to a large extent the region. We partnered with the regional cultural organization in New London County, and we allocated about $500,000 to go to the arts and other cultural, which was probably the largest potential grant that the arts have received or potentially would receive from the city. And we wanted to do this, we wanted to make an impact. I'm an old student of history. I really admired Franklin Roosevelt, and I remember going into post offices and other public buildings and seeing the wonderful murals on the walls. I'm sure everybody has seen them and realizes that they were painted by artists that were hired during the WPA program during the Depression. Well, now we had an opportunity, and the acronym's not that far apart, ARPA, to do a similar type of program. Now, it wasn't all just altruistic and philanthropy. It was quality of life issues, and also was economic issues, because the good example would be here, and I didn't realize it till I got here, that Long Wharf Theater is right next door to here. Well, that's a great economic engine for the region, for that theater. And all our theaters, and we have 3 in Norwich, went dark for about 1.5 years. Of course, if you were an artist, you weren't selling paintings or sculptures. So we saw a real need for that. So we partnered with the regional agency on arts and culture, and we established a grant process where we thought we could make an impact. And it ranged from small allotments to individual artists to commission them to do artwork in the city, similar to WPA of 80 years ago now, to larger grants to make an impact on social agencies that wanted to provide opportunities for children to get educated in things other than just the hard curricular subjects, but arts, that were really cut out of budgets during the lean years that we've had. So we became a philanthropic organization ourselves, which was kind of ironic. We never thought we would be like that. Thanks to CCM, we did have extra money because of the county allocation that was lobbied so heavily for. And the city received $28 million over 2 years. We're in our second allocation now. That's about 25% of our total budget, so you can imagine what an impact that has had. So we tried to do large generational impact things. Hopefully, the murals that are painted in the city of Norwich will prevail 80 years from now. We'll look upon that and say, hey, ARP was a turning point for a lot of people. So thank you.
Thank you. Miriam, do you maybe to kind of provide both the visual bookend, but also the philanthropic bookend to the work that was done in Eastern Connecticut from the philanthropic perspective?
Be happy to, and so pleased to go after our friend John, because I will say that the city of Norwich and the mayor there was one of the first people to come up to me after we embarked on our ARPA initiative to say, I'm 100% behind it, and I'd like to do advocacy with our peers. So let me just back up and just say I'm so grateful to CCP, CCM, and our friends at the Hartford Foundation for bringing us together in person. I gasped at first when I saw it was an in-person meeting. We've gotten so used to, in the last 2.5 years, not to do this. It is my first in person as well. And how wonderful to see good people and friends and be able to make this connection. So when ARPA was announced, we very quickly at the foundation saw this as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to bring about what we think of as real system change. We all know the biggest funder of them all is the federal government. And no amount of money that even the big philanthropies like Ford and Mellon and such can put in the ground can make the kind of systemic change that the federal government can. So we pulled together experts from our region, statewide, and even nationally to ask what would be a dramatic game changer. And there were some 17, 18 ideas that were put on the table of if you invest in this, it could change. The three intertwined areas rose to the top. And they were invest in early childhood care and education, mental wellness and health, and affordable, safe, inclusive housing. And you can imagine if people feel that they are in spaces and they live in communities where they are safe, their kids can go to great schools, they have childcare, they can go to work, if they have mental health issues, if the kids do, if it's addressed, then you have thriving communities. And we're talking about basic human rights. This is not, people see this as some sort of an entitlement. It is not. It's very basic human rights. So we reached out to our 42 town leaders and said, we would like to embark on a 30% plus campaign. Please invest 30% plus of the money that you're getting. And just to put it into context, Eastern Connecticut got over $250 million in ESSER and ARPA funding. That's a lot of money. Just put 30% of that into these three areas, invest there. And let's work with each other and leverage our grant making, our work, your work, and others to make sure that we don't see people falling through the cracks and create thriving communities. So that's how we started off. We had outreach to all of our towns. We have 2 COGs in the region. They both supported an outreach letter that we sent to all the municipalities. The Regional Recovery Committee joined in that effort. We had a number of webinars that helped people think about what does it look like to invest in these areas. We offered and are still offering and helping out with certain towns to get their RFPs out to nonprofits. And so for us, it was very clear that this is a really important partnership and that we are moving forward. And now we are creating a Center for Housing Equity and Opportunities in Eastern Connecticut, again, with the idea of working with our 42 towns to ensure that what we see as a lack of diversity in certain towns, a lack of opportunities for people who work there to live there, that this is addressed so that in the long term, we really see dramatic change. And I guess I would point out that at a time that many of us are conscious that, divisions are increasing and people are distancing in the country over political issues, that we, through our partnership, Philanthropy and the municipalities, have risen above this and shown that in communities, at the local level, we can work together and address basic human rights. Did I address your question?
I think it does. Thank you. Mayor Caggiano, can you tell us a little bit about what happened and is happening in Bristol?
Hello, everybody. Good morning. Happy to be here. And I think the way you phrased the question was great because I was elected in November and inherited a 15-member task force, the ARPA task force, to spend our $28 million of funding that we got, so same as Norwich. That task force was well underway. A 15-member task force is a pretty large task force to get some agreement on. But I had some very good basis to start because we had 3 different subcommittees. So it was 15 for a reason, 5 on the city projects, which is pretty much what a lot of people wanted to do with the money, infrastructure, move that along. 1 was for small businesses and private entities, and the other subcommittee was for the nonprofits, which is kind of more in line with what I'll focus here today. It worked out extremely well for several reasons. First is we had a framework in place, and what I did change when I came in is they were a little bit rudderless. They wanted to spend some money. They didn't know how they would do it. We had hired a vendor, and we came up with an idea to do a competitive grant process for the vast majority of the money. So we took about $3 million, put it on the side, and said, this is going to be our infrastructure money. We can use this for city projects, but we're still going to put an open grant process out there that we closed on January 31st. So nonprofits, as well as all the other sectors, were able to go ahead and give us their best ideas. Well, I told you we had 28 million total, so we put $24 million up for our first round of grant, and we got $84 million worth of requests in, which is great, but it also made it very difficult because we then had to sort through this and decide which projects were the best. So the task force, each of the individual subgroups, and I'm only going to focus on the nonprofit now, came up with their own rubric to say, what is the best thing moving forward that is going to take these dollars? And as we talked about this, it's a little tongue-in-cheek. I don't want anybody to get offended by this, but this is money that we have borrowed from our grandkids. Right? This needs to be transformative. This has to have long-lasting impact, and we need to make sure that this money is very well spent because it is money that we are literally borrowing, and yes, we're trying to come out of a pandemic. I'll focus a little bit on the rubric back to what the nonprofits looked at. That group was made up of 2 very strong individuals that I do want to mention here. I see Kate from the Main Street Community Foundation, but Susan Sadecki from the Main Street Community Foundation, which many of you know, and then Donna Osuch, which was the head of our United Way. And they really, there was others, all of them had some nonprofit ties, and they came together and said, we're going to look at servicing the community, making sure that we get these dollars to underserved populations locally, and looking primarily, I'll go back to the key thing, was that it was COVID mitigation and longer term relief and transformative. And when we talk maybe a little bit more about these projects later, I can give you some examples of what was and what wasn't. But the nonprofit group ended up giving money to 22 different nonprofits locally. It made up over 50% of those $24 million. So they went over $12 million of philanthropy. Some great projects, and I'll talk about some of those more in detail later. But these are truly projects that will move those philanthropies forward, not just get them through the crisis, but also allow them to thrive for the long run. And it was a great process. We had 145 different applications and only granted 45 applications. So that was the toughest part. And the one last thing I will add, in order to help some of these other both private and nonprofits who asked for money and didn't get it, we took a $2 million slot of money and put it aside and said, we called it a Building Bristol Better fund that was a matching grant program. So that if they had a capital project, paving a parking lot for us wasn't transformative, but it's something that's important for some of these nonprofits and other businesses. We told them that we will put this $2 million aside. You were ARPA eligible. We had a vendor that decided whether the projects were ARPA eligible, and then we looked at them deeper to say, how do they fit our longer term goal? If they were ARPA eligible, they could get a 50% matching grant and up to $60,000. So that will hopefully get spread out by another 30 or 40 different entities. Many of those will be the nonprofits, but not all of them nonprofits, and private businesses as well. So very different approach. I will just give a little plug here too. We worked with a vendor called UHY, which has got an office in Farmington here, but they have been very helpful. Again, this was a hard thing for me. I inherited them, and we took almost $1 million of that money to make sure that we can do a process like this. This is labor intensive. There's a lot of information. The ARPA task force members spent hours and hours debating over these projects and going through them, and we need to make sure that the money is appropriated and spent appropriately. So, working with UHY, we're pulling off something that they have said, but I do agree with them, is somewhat different and unique in the state. So, thought I would share that.
Thank you. First Selectman, can you tell us a little bit about what the ARPA efforts were in East Windsor?
Sure, and I'll start off by echoing my thanks for the opportunity to share East Windsor's story here today. As I was listening to Jeff speak, our programs are not dissimilar. There are a couple of key distinctions, though, that I wanted to point out. And first and foremost, in a previous life, I worked for the Connecticut Department of Agriculture under the Malloy administration. And when there was a series of weather events that just laid devastation to agricultural opportunities around the state, the then governor made $5 million available to the Department of Agriculture for some sort of relief opportunity. And so he told us at a press conference on Wednesday that we would have the criteria up on Friday. And that was the first that we had heard about that. So we got around a table with a white piece of paper, and we developed this program called at the time it was called the Plant Grant. And I remember the acronym. It was Production Loss Assistance Necessary Today. So fast forward, and in that case, just as Jeff was pointing out, we had $12 million worth of applicants for $5 million worth of money. So there was some review criteria that we needed to satisfy. Fast forward to the announcement of ARPA in March of 2021, and that memory came right back to me that well, this money is coming down from someplace for a specific reason, and I've already done this. So I pitched to the Board of Selectmen that we could do something similar to that, doing a small business and nonprofit grant program. Is that something that you're interested in doing? But the caveat is we can't move at the speed of government. We need to move much faster than that, because this is supposed to help prop up businesses and nonprofits that are really questioning whether or not they're going to stay in business or remain a presence in the community. So the typical government process was not going to be sufficient. They said yes. We immediately did an RFQ for a consultant. We had 2 applicants. One was a Homeland Security firm out of Virginia, and the other one was my old boss from the Department of Agriculture, who had gone on to work in the Trump administration at USDA, responsible for handing out hundreds of millions of dollars of federal grant money. So he's the one we picked. And the reason for that is twofold. He understood local government, he understood state government, he understood federal government. What are they looking for to make sure that we're going to do things that are in compliance with what the law requires? So that was an easy call, and it was absolutely the right call. He did a fantastic job for us. The next thing we had to do, because we're a small town, we don't get a lot of press coverage, we had to make sure that people knew about it. Because offering this program when there weren't going to be participants wasn't going to do anybody any good at all. So we did everything we could. You know, this is the shotgun approach to getting the word out. We did a press event with our congressional delegation. Senator Blumenthal came, Congressman Larson came, our whole state legislative delegation came. That was one thing that we did. We did press releases. I do community-wide phone calls on a weekly basis. They were included in that. I actually went door to more than 60 businesses asking them to apply because we can help with this. And that, you know, I had one guy go from pretty contentious right off the bat to very surprised that somebody was knocking on his door asking him to apply for this program where he could get effectively free money to him. So at the end of the day, our program was set up. The consultant did the review process with the simple explanation from my board that we want to help people get to yes. This isn't going to be you didn't initial correctly on page 13, you're out. This is help people get to yes. If there's deficiencies in their applications, if there's something missing, follow up with them. Make sure they have an opportunity to correct those deficiencies so that we're meeting our objective, which is to provide support for the small businesses in the community. And one of the things that I'm particularly proud about is how quickly we did that. So we got the first tranche of money in June of last year. By Labor Day, the checks were out and in the mail. That is as fast as we could responsibly do the work that we needed to do in terms of our due diligence and still support that business clientele. At the time, the thought was, if we wait much longer, there's not going to be a need for this support program because anybody who's going to survive the pandemic has survived the pandemic. You know, things looked like they were relatively winding down. That was before 8.6% inflation. That was before supply chain disruption. That was before $5 an hour gasoline. So I think even today, if not more so today, there is still a need for programs like this to be responsive to what's going to keep your grand list healthy. I mean, and that's the long and short of it, particularly for the three guys up here, is to say, like, if your grand list is healthy, that's less we need to tax taxpayers. And so I'm not looking to increase taxes in my community if I can at all avoid it. And making sure that we're retaining businesses and supporting those non-governmental support programs that our nonprofit community provides is really key to that. I think I'll pause there and we'll move on to the next piece, but I'm happy to answer questions as we go along.
Great. I think we will hopefully have time for a couple of follow-up questions from me and maybe one or two questions from out in the audience. So I guess my first follow-up question, and I would encourage anyone to jump in to answer, is what are some of the ways that you perhaps sought input from local residents to both identify, prioritize community need, maybe think about the strategies that you might put forward? Feel free to jump in. So
I'm not sure if this was a good idea or not, but this is what we did. So they each got $28 million from the federal government. I'm the recipient of $3.4 million. With the Erase grant, we used $1.1 million of that towards this program, earmarked another $250,000 for a clean water project, and then we're actually still trying to figure out what we're going to do with the last $2 million. Because of the success and the relative ease of the program we did last year, worst comes to worst, we could easily replicate that. That is an absolute layup in terms of services in the community. But because of this once in an ever opportunity, we wanted to actually solicit community feedback. And so I took our voter list and we did a 9,000-piece direct mailing to constituents in the community, which sounded like a good idea at the time because I didn't really appreciate the gravity of doing a 9,000-piece mailing, so I committed basically 2 town departments for about 3 days stuffing envelopes. They were not pleased with that. But when we got the 700 responses back, which is like an 8% return rate, not bad considering the sample size, responses were all over the board, And so when I was developing the survey, and this is a common thing that I like to do, is we staff it out. You get people around a table and you figure out, okay, what are the priorities? We came up with 52 different priority projects in the community. Anything from food insecurity to infrastructure improvements to environmental quality to tourism support. 52 different projects. And so you can't send out a survey with 52 questions. That's not going to tell you anything at all. So we clustered them into communities of interest. So there was a question of whether or not hard infrastructure should be the priority, or environmental quality, or tourism, or hazard pay for municipal employees was something the unions asked me to do. So we got the feedback of that, and the answer based on those categorizations was not very telling. So now we're still in the process of going through about 700 comments with what people think we should do. The danger that we're running into now is if you only do 5 or 10 things, there's going to be 600 people who think you're not listening to them. So from a government responsiveness perspective, that really has not worked out well for us. But I think it was important to get a benchmark as to where the community is to see, like, this is what people are at least suggesting that we want to do. We're seeing a lot of the hard infrastructure stuff. We're seeing mixed on some of the environmental quality stuff, which is interesting. Some people really, really like solar panels. Some people really, really don't like solar panels. Jeff and I actually have a shared experience in our 2 towns about a solar developer who is I'm working with Tom Conlon a bit. Oh, yeah. So it can be good or bad, but the bottom line is we tried to incorporate public perception and public opinion as much as we could, and now we need to figure out how to salvage that.
And if you don't mind, I'll jump right on that because there is a connection here. When I was elected in November, they were kind of going through that process, and they were listing 50 or so projects that they figured would be good because they solicited the community, a lot of the philanthropy, and it was kind of stalled. So we made the decision at that point to make this a competitive grant process, and we put a deadline. I actually wanted the deadline to be December 31st. New guy in thinks you can do that. But we extended it out to January 31st, and like true philanthropic organizations filling out grants, we had $24 million of requests. And I said, oh, this is going to be great in the middle of January. And then by the end of January, it was $84 million. But what we did in that process was we had all the ideas come forward, baked into a plan on exactly how you're going to spend that money. So now we could say, it just wasn't ideas, it just wasn't opinions, it was the actual projects that are going to get done, and it's worked out well. Again, we are the bad guy. You said 600 people are going to be mad at you because you didn't listen to their opinion. Well, we had 145 requests. We've given out 45 people granted. So we upset 100 different applicants, but I do feel like we came to a relatively quick resolution, got as much community input as we could, and with real projects. It wasn't just input, it was, we're going to do this, and there's some good projects. Hopefully we get to talk about the projects I don't want to take.
Right.
Just briefly, our community, we viewed it as being kind of meeting to death. There's not a lot of interest in going to seminars and meetings, and people are pretty jaded in that. But everybody seems to be interested in the budget process. It's historically fairly contentious, and it's a good drama that people are interested in going to see. So we wrapped our decision process on all our ARP funds into our budget process. And we have quite a few hearings on our budget, and we reserved part of the hearing time for discussions of ARPA projects. Therefore, we got a lot of exposure through the general budget process, and we were able to then integrate the regular budget into the ARP, and it gave kind of a structure to the funding, which we found helpful in going forward.
Thank you. Marion, did you want to jump in?
I will just quickly say that I think anytime you seek to have community voice, it's really complicated because to have meaningful community voice, you need to have an informed public, and we generally don't. It's a very small percentage. So it takes an additional amount of resources, time, commitment to make sure that the public is informed so that you can actually count on the response you're getting and that it's not all over the place as has been commented. We rely generally on our nonprofit leaders to provide a level of feedback of what the greatest needs in the community are, on which we can be responsive. And so in the ARPA process, the selectmen with whom we worked with, we encouraged that they make a special outreach to the nonprofit community so that they would really hear what the greatest needs were.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for a few more moments to share some responses from the panel before we open it up. And I guess I do want to give some time to talk about projects. I guess I would just ask, as you think about kind of a project you might want to lift up more specifically, also want to ask a sub-question about, as we contemplate a second round of funding coming forward from the federal government, what are some of the things, as you know, you're implementing these projects now, that your lessons learned that you're carrying forward as you think about this next round, things you would do differently? I know we talked a little bit, but how some things might be different as you contemplate going forward. But Mayor, perhaps start with you.
Sure. So, you know, 3 of our larger philanthropic projects were one from ELCCT, which is outdoor Barnes Nature Center. They're going to be building a $1.2 million all-access trail that is for anybody. So handicap accessible, will literally be able to go through the woods in a real environment that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do. Our Bristol Boys and Girls Club are building an outdoor playscape and splash pad. You know, for that, it fit a lot of the buckets. It's an underserved community. It's post-COVID mitigation and potential relief if we had another pandemic. And then we also gave $1.1 million to Bristol Health so that they can have an alternative emergency room HVAC operating system for longer-term health. When you look at these projects, I think the way that I link them together is that they were the bigger projects that have that transformative approach, and they're very different. And I'm just going to give one quick example. We won't say the name of the organization, but they asked us to pave their parking lot. And when we put that together with these types of initiatives that are clearly different and going to help a lot of people and make a direct change, we said no to the parking lot and yes to the others. And by the way, the other story I wanted to bring back, where we learned some lessons, is, okay, we had the parking lot is important. The parking lot is awful, I will say that. But when you look at the whole community, what if we took that $2 million that I talked about before, and now we open a grant process that they're already eligible. If you want to match it and get it done, we're now going to see hopefully 30 or 40 improvements throughout the whole city of Bristol. And many of these nonprofits are located in our downtown area, which we are undergoing downtown revitalization for the 61st year, excuse me. So it does play into the overall picture, and I think looking forward, we have to think about that second round and how we might account for some of that.
Leave space for anyone else who wants to kind of go a little deeper on a project or thinking forward.
So 2 points on that. The first is, one of the best lessons learned that I would take away from our grant program is that the consultant that we brought on is somebody who had already made a whole bunch of mistakes in a similar program to this. He and I, 10 years ago, made all these mistakes. And so one of the really attractive things about bringing him onto the team was that we wouldn't make those mistakes again. We made a collection of brand new ones, but they were much smaller in scale, and we could kind of smooth them out. The bumps in the road, the having to figure out how you turn 100 people out of 150 away, we had already addressed things like that 10 years ago. So being able to draw on those lessons learned from past professional experiences was something that was a real help to us. And then, as we're talking up here and I'm listening to my fellow panelists, the question that comes to mind is, are we going to be able to do something that's going to be transformative or sustainable or both? And it's trying to hit the bullseye on that both that I think is going to be most difficult for us. In part because the responses that I got from the community are so diverse that's going to become problematic to make that really impactful. But we're as a community, this is a little inside baseball, but as a community, we are in bad need of a community center. Our senior center currently cohabitates with a fire department on the top floor based on a grant that they got 50 years ago. The building was outdated when it was built before I was born. So what we're trying to do is figure out, because our population is 10% older than the population in Hartford County, we know that there's a demand for services that's on the older end of the spectrum. So how are we positioning ourselves as a community to make sure that we can deliver the services that people need to help them to age in place? And at the same time, make sure that we're using a new space in as beneficial a way to as much of the community as possible. So I don't think we're going to use our ARPA funds for that, although we may. I'm working on other means of piecing together the components to make that become a reality, but I think that would probably be something that checks both of those boxes in terms of both transformative and sustainable, but it is still kind of to be determined.
Thank you. So I want to make sure that we can take advantage of not having to put questions in a chat box or and make sure that we can pass around the microphone. Okay. So we can pass around a microphone and maybe just give a hand raise if you have a question. And I think we have somebody over here.
Hi, so my question is about what sorts of accountability or reporting mechanisms have you put in place for these grant projects?
Ours is easy because we are an entitlement city that got $28 million. We have quarterly reporting that goes back to the federal government. So it was imposed on us. We were going to do it anyway because our city council wanted to know where we stood on projects, if we were spending the money and all that. So we were going to do it anyway. In fact, the council just recently passed a resolution that we would do quarterly reports. And I kind of smiled to myself because I knew we were doing them already. So for us, it was easy. We were mandated to do it. And so we had that accountability inculcated into the projects.
Ours was actually easier than that. So because of how quickly the town of East Windsor did this program, we were not operating under the final rule that was issued by the federal government. We were operating under the interim final rule. So with the anticipation that there would be a reporting requirement, we actually, in the contract between the town and the recipient, we made them disclose and take an attestation as to how they were going to use the money. That way, in the event that the IRS came and knocked on our door and wanted to audit our books, we could turn around and say, here's their sworn statement saying that this is what they were going to use this for, go talk to them. That was one way that we covered ourselves, but then when the final rule came out, they actually included language in there that said that any mistakes made under the interim final rule, so long as they were well-meaning, were effectively forgiven. So that kind of dovetails with the urgency with which we moved to support them at the outset, but then when the final rule came down, we had plenty of coverage to say, like, we're within the lines.
So, and I agree with both, and I'm somewhere in the middle, but I inherited this project, and our vendor is the one that's actually sending out those contracts now. So I said, we have allocated $24 million. That's not quite true because the contracts are being executed so that we can do that. And it's a labor-intensive project, so I think for us, the vendor was extremely important, who has the experience with it. We have our own internal reporting, all of that, our comptroller's all over it, but it'll be a nice check and balance for us.
Hi, I've heard Jason a couple times you talk about your program. We're doing a small, I feel like we're being very cheap, but we use a lot of our money through our budget process for capital project. Pardon me? Oh, I'm the first selectman in the town of Simsbury. So we integrated it into our budget process. We did social work, we did some school HVAC, we've done parks and rec, just a mishmash to get into the budget so it saves all our taxpayers, right? And it goes to the benefit of everybody. But we have a few small programs. We did one regional with our health district. We're looking at a business program, and we are doing a nonprofit with a small bucket. But one of the questions that's come up, we have an application, is is your nonprofit required to be based in your town? Is it have to just serve your community? What are the requirements that you've put on the nonprofit? Or can it be a Hartford nonprofit that serves no one in Simsbury or, East Windsor?
Ours was hard. because the city council did narrow it down to projects and organizations that are in Norwich. And that's difficult somewhat because a lot of the things we were doing had a regional approach. So although it was well-intended to try to keep it within the community, I think it made it more difficult for us to do that. And I would urge people to think more regionally with an emphasis on your locality, but to think a little more regionally because you get a little more participation that way.
So in our case, we did keep things to a local base, so it had to be based within the community. That was actually one of a number of questions that we at the staff level, when we were developing the criteria, kind of brainstormed out is, are we going to do, like CRT as an example, is based in Enfield, the next town up. Is that an organization that we would consider granting versus the Five Corner Food Pantry, which is based in East Windsor? And ultimately, we decided to keep them with an East Windsor presence. One of the other interesting questions that your question reminds me of that we really talked a lot about is how do you handle applicants that had a delinquency in property taxes? Are you going to support applicants who may owe the town money? And ultimately, it was my tax collector who carried the day on this. And her argument was, well, if they're having cash flow issues, then that could be a contributing reason why they weren't paying their taxes. So we actually opted to ignore tax delinquency as a disqualifier. And there was one other point that maybe when somebody else speaks, I'll think of, but
I'll bail you out just to say that we are interesting in Bristol because we're a relatively large municipality in between two different COGs. So, Hartford, Waterbury, NVCOG, CROG. So we really did operate pretty independently, but again, we got a later start. And our focus was it had to be Bristol focused and help the most people in Bristol. That's really what our committee came up with in their idea and mindset. Would love to work regionally, but I think that's, to be honest, too, it's only 3.3 left. It was supposed to be 4 million, but we went a little over our budget. To work regionally on some of the DOT projects that are coming. So we're thinking about those competitive grants that are, partially funded by the municipality. We're hoping to work with our local counterparts on the infrastructure stuff. Again, very small part of our total ARPA funding, but that's one way to think about it as well.
Great. I think I'm getting instruction that we have time for one more question.
And the question just brought something up that I wanted to remind us all. Initially, the Treasury's guidelines were use this money for equitable and transformative change in your community. We thought that's terrific. We can do that. And then they backtracked. They pulled that away. Use it for whatever you want, including parking lots, paving roads, which we thought was terrible. So it's so heartening that so many leaders in our municipalities kept that viewpoint of we're going to use this money to make people's lives better who are struggling. And that's how our communities thrive, not by, I'm sorry to say, creating more parking lots.
Thank you, Mary.
So I have a question about whether or not you found creative ways to provide sustainability. I run two community organizations, two foundations, and what we know from our local nonprofit organizations is that where they're struggling right now is with intense service delivery issues. They're serving more and more people with fewer resources, and also that they're having a really hard time, like many businesses across the state, finding and maintaining workers. So trying to address both of those things are not transformational necessarily. They could be sustainable if there was funding available beyond the funding term limit. So I'm wondering, how do you balance addressing what are the true existing needs within our nonprofit organizations with the rules of the funding, and whether you found anything creative to address that?
Not a direct answer, perhaps, but we also came up with another program that went across both kind of business, nonprofit, and city called Bristol Works, where we're going to do a workforce development center in Bristol. These things are highly sought after in Bristol in particular. Again, we sit in between two different regional county governments, and we send people to other places, but I think there's a lot of money out there for workforce development, which will make it hopefully sustainable. So we actually are spending $2.2 million to build the site, to get it up and running, and to offer schooling for people that are underemployed to get them to a higher level for 2 to 3 years. They're debating on how long that will last, but then we're going to ask them to go out and get that philanthropic money and state grants and other things to continue it. So giving them that kickstart may be that sweet spot. Well, it'll remain to be seen, but we felt it was certainly transformative, and we definitely lean towards that transformative project. Can we make an impact today as quickly as possible? This money has to be spent by 2026 and allocated by 2024. How do we make the most impact and put that all together? So it's a great question. I don't think I really answered your question, but it's something to think about.
So I would say that one of the things that wow, that is a great question. So we have $2.1 million left in our $3.5 million allocation, which is actually still $2 million more than we thought we were going to get, because when we started our program, we hadn't gotten the non-entitlement unit numbers yet. So we thought we were just going to get $1.4 million. So that was, we were going to do the Small Business and Nonprofit Assistance Program and this Clean Water Project. So now fast forward to where we are today. We've done this community-based survey. My board has a decision that they're going to have to make. Are we going to do, with $2.1 million, we're a small fish. I mean, that is just, we're a small fish. Are we going to do one really big project for our community? Are we going to do a couple of medium-sized things for our community? Or are we going to do a whole bunch of small things for our community? And sometimes they can be a combination of those. For example, we're hearing a lot about how people want to have more walking trails for passive recreation in the area. Well, in order to put in a walking trail, you need to buy a Bobcat. That's a $50,000 piece of equipment. You buy a Bobcat, then you have a Bobcat, and you can put in walking trails, you can do other infrastructure maintenance. There is a ripple that happens more than just the one intended use. So we're still in the process of figuring out what that is, but I'll tell you, I am a proponent of, one, borrowing liberally somebody else's good idea, and two, of groupthink, which is, there's no bad idea. Everybody get around a table. Let's talk about this and see if we can come up with a solution that really sounds like it's going to jump. And just I haven't thought at all about the legalities of any of this, but just in the course of this conversation, and it's Miriam actually who made me think of this. We have $2.1 million left. Could we work with a group like the Hartford Foundation and set up some sort of a trust where we draw off the interest earnings to sustain that? Could we work with other, and you're shaking your head no, so but it's a different conversation. Yeah, but I'm wondering, could we grant it to them? Just like we're doing with these other things, with an understanding that the earnings would be pulled off for supporting mental health programs in the community, as an example. I don't know if it's just, this is a brainstorm that I have an hour drive home, I'll fester on this for a little while. Well, but if that's not the answer, maybe that will lead to the next thing. And so then it's not a question so much of, are we putting in sidewalks and dredging the pond versus are we doing something that's going to be lasting beyond 2026? And that's, I think, that becomes a conversation point that our governing body needs to have.
And I will take the opportunity, because I know we need to get ready for our next panel, to say that I think that's a great door opener to the next conversations over the next couple of months, years, which is what are the opportunities for municipalities and philanthropy to work together. I think there are many creative opportunities. I think there are ways to do things even when they haven't been done before. And there are, we know that philanthropy cannot fill the gap to make up for the dollars that have, come in or exist in the public sector. But we also know our dollars are flexible, they're nimble. We have other structures like funds that can be held and give time for planning and some more sustainability, as well as we mentioned early on in the panel, opportunities to think about making the case collecting the information and the learning to make the case to talk to national philanthropy and others to bring dollars to Connecticut when we show them how well, and an example on the folks on this panel shared, the dollars have been put into use. So I want to thank our panel. Thank you very much. And hopefully we have an opportunity during the networking session to be able to ask additional questions and garner other conversation. So I'm going to pass the baton to Carla.
On our last panel, we really were hearing a lot about how philanthropy and municipalities were thinking about those ARPA dollars, how they were distributing them in their towns and cities. On this panel, we're really going to be talking about how funders, nonprofits, and municipalities are actually working together with some of the ARPA dollars and how they're using them to really try and address community challenges. So often in my conversations with people, I hear nonprofits or municipal leaders or philanthropy leaders talking about the issues that they're working on, and often they're doing it independently of others, and often not making as much progress as they'd like to. So in this panel, we're going to be really highlighting the way that folks are working together to address community challenges. I'm joined by, Kevin Moynihan, First Selectman of the Town of New Canaan, Lauren Patterson, President and CEO of the New Canaan Community Foundation, Jay Williams, President and CEO of the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving, Thea Montanez, COO for the City of Hartford, and Jeff Shaw, Senior Public Policy Advisor at the Connecticut Community Nonprofit Alliance. So I'm going to start with Lauren and Kevin. Can you talk start by introducing yourself and talking a little bit about how you came to work together in New Canaan and how you've been working to address mental health needs in the town?
Sure, thank you. And good morning, everyone. So my name is Kevin Moynihan. I'm in my 5th year as First Selectman of the Town of New Canaan. I'm a retired lawyer from Wall Street. When I retired, I started looking for things to do other than play golf, and I started volunteering, and I joined the Community Foundation Board. Lauren is our president of our Community Foundation, which is about 40 years old. 47 years old. And so when you go on a Community Foundation Board, we have a fabulous Community Foundation, which started out as raising money for capital grants, but then when our United Way, local United Way, dissolved, they've taken over both the human services and other aspects of what a community foundation does. As Lauren will explain, she has a career in community foundations, and but being on a community foundation, I really got to know our town and know our nonprofits. And in a town like New Canaan, which is 21,000 people, volunteers and nonprofits are an essential part of our infrastructure to make things work in town, both with respect to government and also with respect to quality of life and human services and arts and all the things that the Community Foundation supports. So having that background with the Community Foundation, when ARPA funds came along, New Canaan is a very lucky town. I mean, obviously being a suburb of Manhattan, we have a very, very affluent community. So when we don't generally get state or federal funds, so when we got $6 million, our government said, our structure of our government is a 12-member town council, 3-member board of selectmen, and a board of finance. So we said, well, let's use our appropriation process to decide how to spend these funds. And we've taken our time. Rather than trying to come up with a master plan up front, as other cities and towns did, we said, let's begin to look at ideas and vet them, and over time, so we're 12 months into the process, we've committed about 75% of our funds. But we really, as was discussed earlier in the earlier panel, we wanted to make things that were impactful and would and stand the test of time. So we'd look back and say, we're really glad we did that with funds that, on our annual appropriation process, we usually get to the point of saying, well, that's a nice to have versus a need to have, and the nice to have sort of go by the board. So this is an opportunity to look at nice to haves, things we've talked about, thought about. And these opportunities, because I had been on the Community Foundation Board, we had talked One of the things the Community Foundation does is assess the needs of the community. So why don't I turn it to Lauren for a few minutes to explain her role as the Community Foundation relating to the town.
Sure. Good morning. So many of you are community foundations or in the room, or you may work with them. But if you don't, one of the key things that we like to focus on, we call community leadership, which for lack of a kind of a better term is a way for us to invest in, rally around, bring people and diverse stakeholders together around common issues. And something that predated the pandemic, I would say fortunately, is that we started to focus more and more over the last 4 or 5 years on behavioral health issues in our community. So something largely stigmatized, very much in hushed tones, and something that you asked trusted friends, neighbors, family members for advice, as issues arose, and generally when you were in crisis, but it was not a visible community issue that the foundation would speak about, that other large organizations might lead on. And so something that we do, I would say, is more informal levels of kind of community engagement and conversation. And that's when, going back 4 or 5 years ago, people were talking about the opioid crisis. They were talking about stress and anxiety, family stressors, in one way or another. And this was all sort of starting to hang together under the umbrella of behavioral health. So the Community Foundation launched a committee to really kind of dig in on this issue. And this is an area where I would say we never thought we would go it alone. It was always alongside with and in close partnership with town. So town government, for example, their Health and Human Services Department, had standing committees of providers. We were always a participant in those settings. Vice versa, they were always an important invited partner when we had listening sessions, but our tables that we were setting looked a little bit different. It was the nonprofit provider, the pastor from the local church, it was the mom that ran the Girl Scout troop, and it was all of them collectively saying, this is the issue we see and how we could work differently on this issue. So we, I would say, don't do, as a small community foundation, large data gathering efforts, but these kind of smaller settings. And this was setting the course for us on this behavioral health pathway. To Kevin's credit, I think when the ARPA dollars came down, he was thinking about what could we do to launch these nice to haves, which really, they're more than nice to haves, because we were talking about affecting health and behavioral health care in our community. What we heard previously from our community was, we are program rich, but no one as a general resident knows where to start. Again, you make those hushed phone calls and you find out who's the therapist that you like, that you've worked with. But even in the private pay space, if you could afford to go that route, there are long waiting lists. It's very confusing to know where to start. And so we are very fortunate to have Silver Hill Hospital in our town. A large and very well-known and trusted mental health institution. And so do you want to talk about sort of the launch of that partnership with Silver Hill?
Sure. So actually, I participated in your sessions when
Yes.
pre-COVID to identify what we could do with respect to behavioral health. But I had a meeting, I think, during the summer before COVID with a leader in our town who had lost his son to drug overdose. And he started a group called the Parent Support Group. And that's been in operation for like 5 years. And I sat down with the head of that organization and I said, you know what we need in this town? We need a fund to be able to support individuals and families in a crisis, whether it's drug abuse, alcoholism, domestic violence, suicide attempt, and we have Silver Hill Hospital, which you call it a large organization. It's actually a premier small organization. I've been in New Canaan 40 years, and I drove by Silver Hill Hospital for many years, and I always regarded it as the place that celebrities and movie stars go to dry out or for rehab. But it's actually a tremendous local facility who historically has not done as much to be part of the community as perhaps we would expect. So anyway, this idea of creating a fund, and I looked to the Community Foundation when I talk about creating funds, So then when ARPA came along, I said, let's use some of the ARPA funds to bootstrap, to seed this program. So we decided to work with Silver Hill Hospital to have the town allocate $250,000. But I thought, we're not the only town that has this need. Our neighboring communities, Wilton, Darien, even Ridgefield, are the neighbors of Silver Hill Hospital, and perhaps we can get them to join us. So we invited them. We haven't gotten all the way there yet, but we're working on that idea. But the whole idea is, as Lauren said, when someone has a crisis, whether it's alcoholism, drug abuse, suicide, the family doesn't know where to turn, and they need an immediate support. So we're developing this program where Silver Hill Hospital will, within 48 hours, spend a day to assess an individual and help them find the right resource. So.
And I would say the really exciting thing about this model, which I think Silver Hill would say, they're hoping this could be a model elsewhere in the state or country, is that this 3-hour assessment that an individual will be able to access is with a team of care providers at Silver Hill Hospital. And we are using the ARPA dollars to cover anything that insurance would not cover. So resources are not the barrier to that assessment and that first step towards getting a family into care. And then most importantly, there will be a warm handoff to a trusted provider and a vetted provider. And I think the head of Silver Hill Hospital was previously in private practice, and he would tell the story that, if someone called him off the street and said, hey, when can I get in? Weeks and weeks, months maybe. But if a colleague of his called and said, hey, I've already talked with this patient. They're showing with XYZ. I know that you are the guy to provide this care. Okay, I can see him next week. So the hope is we can really help with some of the bottleneck in the behavioral health system, and to use ARPA dollars to pilot this, underwrite this, and then over time, we do need to figure out how to transition this to private philanthropy potentially.
Great, thank you, thank you. Jay and Thea, let's hear from you. How is the foundation and the city working together to address some of the community challenges there in Hartford?
Yeah, well, I'll start just generally, and because the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving serves 29 towns in central Connecticut, Hartford being the largest and where we are grounded. And there have been, just numerous opportunities that we have had to collaborate over the course of many, many years. I've been at the foundation for 5 years, and certainly the pandemic provided an opportunity for us to even collaborate more closely. So there are so many projects. I'm going to defer to Thea to talk about whichever of those projects, and we'll certainly talk about how we see our role in working as a convener, as a place to be a thought partner, as a place to exercise the flexibility that we have as a community foundation. And again, we are blessed to have significant resources and significant discretionary resources that really allow us to be creative and innovative with an eye always toward lifting up the region. So, specifically, there's, a half dozen that I thought of off the top of my head, but I'll defer to Thea as the COO of the City of Hartford to pick any number of those projects, and then happy to talk about how we have leveraged the resources together, and again, with an eye towards sustainability, with an eye toward equitable impact and benefit of the relationship that we've established.
Thank you, Jay. Good morning, everybody. I'm Thea Montanez, Chief Operating Officer of the City of Hartford. I joined Mayor Bronin in 2016 as his Chief of Staff, and then in 2020 was appointed by the Mayor and the City Council as the COO 1 month before the pandemic was declared. So I would say a couple of things. First, the City of Hartford was very fortunate. I think we received a total award with ARPA funds between the direct funds from Treasury and then our county allocation, a total of about $112 million. I remember when we received that notification, Mayor Bronin ran into my office. He was so excited, and he was like, "We've got $112 million." And I thought, oh God, we've got $112 million. Because I knew as the COO what that meant, right? The responsibility that we had to ensure that there were controls in place, there was a process that was transparent, that we were being accountable not just to the federal government, but to our community. And so we spent several months working in partnership with our city council and our state delegation and our community stakeholders and the Hartford Foundation as one of our critical thought partners to figure out what would that spending plan, what would that look like? All of that information, by the way, is on our website, hartford.gov. We have a page that is specifically dedicated to our ARPA spending plan. It gives you an overview of our funding priorities as well as the process that we led to determining our spending plan and where we are to date. So all of that information is available online. So I would say we've started working together actually before the pandemic in 2016. As many of you know, the city was on the brink of bankruptcy. And so at that point, we were reaching out to all of our community stakeholders, including the foundation. I think Jay had just joined the board. And we began having conversations about what bankruptcy would mean, not just to residents and businesses, but the overall community. And we didn't know where we were headed, but we knew we needed to talk about it. And we needed the community to understand what it meant for them if we were to end up filing bankruptcy. And the Hartford Foundation was a critical partner in helping us think that through. And in fact, they supported and helped us host various community conversations on that topic, which is probably one of the most difficult things, right, you can talk about. And so, as part of our trying to stabilize the budget, I think one of the worst days I had at work was when I had to call, 30 nonprofits, including homeless providers, to tell them we did not have the funding to be able to support them for that particular year, but we were committed to figuring it out. So if the city couldn't pay for it, we would find somebody that could. And I think we were able to survive that time because of partners like the Hartford Foundation that stepped up, that were willing to help us think through, how could we support these organizations that are doing that type of critical work. So I'm really grateful to Jay and Alyssa, who is one of my favorite people. We are constantly in communication about all sorts of things, and she is, again, somebody that I rely on, to help me think through issues that come up. In Hartford, there's lots of things that come up. It is not boring. One of those things that we've been chatting about is our American Rescue Plan. As Jay indicated, we have partnered together on several initiatives, everything from providing our residents with free Wi-Fi to supporting justice-involved youth and adults. And so one of the partnerships I'm really proud of is the work around our Hartford Reentry, our Greater Hartford Reentry Welcome Center. So that is a location. It used to be in Hartford City Hall. It opened in 2018. Where if you were a person who had just been released from incarceration or who had a criminal history, you would go to that location and you would meet with staff from Community Partners in Action who would, help you figure out where to go, whether it was for job training or housing or food securities. That opened up in 2018, and again, it was able to open because of the generosity of the Hartford Foundation. They provided the funding that we needed to open up that space. It has been so successful that it's expanded, and so it has a beautiful new location not too far from Hartford City Hall, where they have even more space to help even more people, to invite even more nonprofit partners inside of the space to work with folks who are coming home from incarceration. And so given the initial funding that the Hartford Foundation provided in 2018, we were able to use our American Rescue Plan dollars to also make an investment. And again, the Hartford Foundation stepped up for a second grant award to support the Reentry Center. So we are able to serve even more people, not just upon release, but also pre-release, which is really critical to their being able to make a successful transition. Hartford has one of the highest reentry populations in the state of Connecticut. So we knew that it was critical, not just in terms of public safety, but also trying to ensure that our folks are able to be employed, right? That they are set up to succeed. And for a very long time, the Department of Corrections, would drop folks off in the middle of nowhere, and wish them the best. And I am so proud of the fact that we've developed a partnership with the Department of Corrections where we actually schedule releases ahead of time. So our reentry team will work with the DOC. We will, settle on a date and time, and then the staff at the reentry center is waiting for that person to come home, to welcome them home, to get them set up for success. And so that took some time to do, but I think we are doing it. And as part of the reentry center, we just actually launched a new workforce development program. It is a neighborhood ambassadors jobs program. And so we were able to take some CDBG funding along with, again, generous contribution from the Hartford Foundation and ARPA funds to get this program up and running. So we are actually taking folks that are coming in through the reentry center. We are training them to be neighborhood ambassadors, and we are employing them. And so in addition to the support they receive from the reentry center, we are now able to pay them to help beautify our commercial corridors throughout the city. So we actually just started that cohort of 10 people. I think it was almost 2 months ago. You know, it's already making a difference. I can't tell you how many residents in our neighborhoods have contacted me because they've seen our ambassadors, you know, in front of small businesses, picking up litter, helping, you know, maintain the commercial corridors. The first day that they started, I was so excited. I actually got in my car and was like chasing them down Franklin Avenue. And I like jumped out and I introduced myself and I thanked them. And one gentleman said to me, Miss, you shouldn't thank me. I've done a lot of things in my life I'm not proud of, but I've never been given the chance to do something positive. And this is my way of doing something positive. So, you know, we've been hearing a lot of that from folks that are participating in this program. But again, the Reentry Center and the Ambassadors Program is really made possible not just through ARPA, but also through the Hartford Foundation.
One of the key things that I hope you caught when Thea was describing the Reentry Center is the Greater Hartford Reentry Center. And central cities play a critical role in the region, often overlooked, often underappreciated, but very essential. Because the reentry population that come back to the city of Hartford aren't all city residents. Some of them are, but they are residents of the region. And for the notion, and I'm not gonna use the term the cities carry the burden, but the cities do carry the weight often of providing services that are beneficial to the region. So to the extent that we are a regional community foundation, Hartford is not only the capital of the state of Connecticut, but the largest community in the region. Doesn't make it more important than the other communities, but it does have to address some of the issues that are pertinent to the region. So to that end, that this is an asset that is based in Hartford, that Hartford has led, but also Hartford recognizing its role as a larger part of the region. So I think that's also very, very important when we talk about ways to collaborate, when we talk about the importance of understanding the importance of the region. So taking nothing away from the individual communities and all the characteristics and positive attributes that exist in each and every one of the 169 towns and cities that exist in this state, when we have an opportunity to benefit the region, that is something that we also look very favorably upon. And I commend Mayor Bronin and Thea for certainly first and foremost being obligated to address the needs of the residents of the city of Hartford proper, but they do that, and they also don't ignore the fact that Hartford plays such a critical role in the region. So to that end, I think it's also a shining example of being able to do both, being able to address the needs of the city, but also understand that this is an asset. So the programs that are supporting those individuals who are coming back, whether they happen to ultimately be residents of or choose to reside in the city of Hartford or somewhere else in the region, I think are things that we hope that would be an example for other opportunities for us to leverage the resources we have, to leverage the resources that are part of this, again, always with an eye towards sustainability, accountability, and equity, which is what Thea also referenced.
Yeah, I appreciate Jay's point. I mean, I indicated we received a $112 million allocation, but I promise you that many of the services we provide are not just for Hartford residents. In fact, we are home to, the most homeless shelters that there are in the region. A third of people that are homeless that are using our shelter system that we are contributing to are non-city residents, right? And so those are resources we're taking away from our city residents, right, in order to support the needs of the region, because there are not homeless shelters, many of them outside of Hartford. The reentry is a great example. I am constantly in community and talking to people. And many times I will ask them, where is, their place of residence? Oftentimes it's not Hartford. The city has about 1,000 cameras throughout the city. And we have seen video of other towns and municipalities, whether it's their police department, for example, dropping off residents from their communities and bringing them to Hartford so that they can receive critical services. And you know what? We are so proud of the fact that we're able to do that, and we will continue to do it. And for many things, we're really good at it. But I just appreciate the point that Jay's making, where that $112 million is again, we're grateful, and it's a lot of funding. But again, it's not just for city residents. I really see that we are doing this for the region, not just for Hartford.
Thank you. Thank you. Jeff, let me bring you into the conversation. So we've heard about how foundations and municipalities are partnering together. What are the kinds of leadership and assets that nonprofits can bring to address community challenges?
Sure, and thank you again for inviting me, as well as quick shout out to, where's Mike? I thought I saw him earlier. Mike at CCM. Just wanted to say thank you again on behalf of the Alliance for including us in the advisory committee on local ARPA, but as well as our host today, CCP and the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving, and all of you for being here. I guess I just wanted to do a quick, brief overview of what the Nonprofit Alliance is. And we are the voice of nonprofits, literally, not just figuratively. We're a statewide association, membership association, with members in all 169 cities and towns in the state. Our members range in size from one full-time employee to one organization that has 1,400 employees in 60 different towns. We provide membership services, cost savings, professional development and training. We have an annual conference, we do networking, and of course advocacy, which is my role in the organization, part of a team that does advocacy and capacity building. About half of our members are human service providers, of which you just heard 2 examples of. Sort of the other half falls into a broader bucket of philanthropy, both family, private foundations, and of course our community foundation friends. We also have land conservation organizations. We also have other statewide advocacy associations and everything in between. If you're a 501c3 nonprofit organization, you can be part of our association. So again, quick overview of the organization. I guess I would offer three things in terms of leadership and resources. The first thing is, nonprofits really try to increase the quality of life in the communities of which they serve, and of course the people that live in those communities. They deliver services. We're talking about feeding the hungry, housing people experiencing homelessness. We're talking about people going through mental health or substance abuse treatment, providing the places for them to get well. They do this by partnering, and that's, I think, why I'm here. They do this with all 3 branches of government, local, state, and federal. Just quick examples in terms of the executive branch in the state. There's about 500 plus organizations that contract with about 12 state agencies. I think that comes out to 1,200 contracts worth over $1 billion worth of services that either wouldn't be provided at all, people would be on their own, figure that out, or the state would have to provide them. Nonprofits partner with the legislative branch by serving on commissions, task force, work groups, and committees, usually co-chairs with a state agency counterpart. So very invested, very collaborative in those processes. We also contract or partner with the judicial branch through the Court Support Services Division, working with the juvenile justice population. Local government, just heard about local ARPA, as well as some nonprofits recently have gotten into contracts to provide mental health clinics in schools where there might not be those resources already, and certainly with federal funding, applying for federal grants. So in terms of just in the community, trying to increase quality of life. The second thing is nonprofits are economic engines. A lot of people don't think about that, but excuse me, I just need to reference the numbers here. Sometimes they even surprise me. 115,000 nonprofit employees in the state. That does not include hospitals or colleges. That's $13.5 billion worth of wages and tens of billions of dollars in economic activity. One quick example in Manchester is that there's a group home. The CEO just shared some of their economic data with me a couple weeks ago. $1 million annually, in terms of groceries, utilities, snow removal, landscaping, fuel. And those purchases are being made in the local communities of which they reside and which they serve. A lot of nonprofit staff have to have or maintain professional licenses. They have to run accredited organizations. So these are professionals, highly trained, highly skilled, highly educated, and leading in their communities. And I guess the last thing I'll just sort of close with is nonprofits are trusted voices in their communities. They're mission-driven organizations, you heard before, with volunteer board members, dedicated staff that really understand sort of what's going on in the community, know the pulse of the community, what they're seeing on the ground. They provide a voice for the voiceless in some instances, whether it's children, seniors, people with complex needs. They educate the public on vital issues. It occurred to me that Census 2020 was something where at least 4 of us or 3 of us on this panel worked together to try to bring attention to people, to get that on their radar, to make sure they filled out their census questionnaires. And then finally, they engage the community, as you heard. They're volunteers, they engage donors, they leverage relationships. So they're trusted voices of the community and they want to help. So I think that's sort of the leadership and the resources that nonprofits bring.
That's great. I know in my work trying to bring people together to collaborate, how important it is to develop some relationships among the organizations before you expect outcomes. I wonder, Kevin, Lauren, Jay, Thea, if you could talk a little bit about some of the best practices you've learned, like what makes your partnerships work?
What makes our partnership work? First of all, being a small community, everyone knows each other. The Community Foundation tends to be a training ground for people to get involved and then spin off and work with a particular nonprofit. So your thoughts?
I would say, well, particular to our partnership, right? We are in a small community. The town and the Community Foundation are the large funders. So we are always, talking information, trying to understand the ways that we can work better together. I think there is trust, there's ongoing relationships. I think in launching some of these ARPA-specific projects, it's great to have multiple checkpoints, a lot of transparency. Neither of us want to be in the press unexpectedly, right? So it's great to be able to coordinate to some degree behind the scenes and rally some important support, and we can do that in different ways.
I'll give you another example. We decided to allocate about 10 or 15% of our ARPA funds to the nonprofits, but the town government can't possibly identify who needs what. So we asked the Community Foundation, being the experts in our nonprofits, they have an annual grant program where 60 or 70 nonprofits get grants. So we basically outsourced to them. We said, we will give you up to $1 million to have a grant program. And so the Community Foundation solicited grant requests, COVID impact related, and so we're finishing up that process, and you're going to come back with recommendations, I think, by Friday, as to how much we should allocate to the nonprofits.
I knew that deadline, don't worry. And the other thing I would mention too, that this ties into some of the ARPA relationships, but predates it as well, that we've had a lot more public-private partnerships in town to get different sorts of projects going or get them done. So things like athletic facilities in town, restoration of a bird preservation, all sorts of things. But the Community Foundation has served as a vehicle for residents who want to rally and get these projects done to form a charitable fund under our umbrella and raise those resources, and then they get to do all of the things that they're good at. The project planning, the fundraising with their friends and neighbors. We do all the back office services and then are able to partner with the town and either hand off a check to town government or directly into this nonprofit project. We've done that more and more over the years, and I think that's been a great kind of predecessor to some of our ARPA work together.
I would echo, Kevin and Lauren are right in the importance of establishing those personal relationships. So we are a relatively large funder and working with the city of Hartford, for example, a large municipality. But it's still important for me as a CEO and my executive team and all of our staff to establish those individual relationships, because in a large bureaucracy, it's easy to sort of see a department or get lost in trying to navigate that. But to the extent that our staff, from the newest staff members who have just joined us to, again, all the way through the senior executive staff, to have individual relationships, to establish that trust, to be flexible and understand the processes. Bureaucracy gets a bad name, but it serves a purpose, because when you're dealing with public funds and public resources, you do have to have a very methodical, transparent process by way you make decisions. And that doesn't always lend itself to being as expeditious as even the people involved might want it to be, but it's important when you're dealing with public resources. So on our end, yes, we do have a great degree of flexibility, but in the past, we could also get caught up in our own processes and be too rigid and too risk averse. So what we have found is that being flexible, having that level of trust, being willing to exercise a degree of discretion and understanding at the end of the day, we may have to go about it a different way, and being willing to do that. But ultimately, if we have that shared goal or looking for that shared outcome, there are very few things I think that we aren't able to accomplish, for the good. So I think once you have those victories and those successes, it builds ongoing trust, and it shows and demonstrates a willingness to do everything within our power to both understand the strengths and the challenges and the processes of the partnerships that we're in, but at the same time being willing to extend ourselves perhaps a little bit more than we would have otherwise been if we think that the outcome and the benefit is of great significance to the community.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. I in another lifetime, used to work for an insurance company managing local giving as well. So I've been on both sides of it. And I think, the relationship piece is so important so that it is not transactional, right? So it's not these check writing exercises or these kind of one and dones, right? Like to really build a partnership, and that requires spending time together and getting to know what our priorities are, and trusting each other, and knowing that and I don't ever doubt this for a second, that the foundation is genuinely trying to help our community, right, and our residents. And so, knowing that and knowing we too share that, right, I think makes the biggest difference. And knowing that we also, many times, sometimes the right thing to do sometimes can be the hardest thing to do, because it's not the most popular thing to do, and know that you have a partner who's willing to be courageous and who's willing to do that hard work with you. It is not necessarily, bankruptcy, right? Like having to talk about bankruptcy is not something everybody felt was appropriate. There were some people in the community that pushed back and wanted, and had an issue with us doing it. And the foundation, again, stepped up and said, like, we're here to support you, and we believe in what it is that you're trying to do. And so we are going to support this conversation, right? There are some partners that would have not wanted to take that chance and in that moment exhibit, what I would describe as courage. So, I think all of those things really have what led to such a strong partnership with the foundation.
Great, thank you. How are we doing on time? Okay, great. So I want to save some time for Q&A, but before we go to you in the audience, Jeff, could you talk a little bit about, are there best practices people should keep in mind when they're reaching out to local nonprofits? Are there things that we should know about that community that could be useful?
Yeah, thank you. The first thing that I jotted down was, town lines, again, to municipal friends, and catchment areas to philanthropy friends, they don't matter as much to nonprofits. They really are there to serve the community need, and that's a greater need than maybe sort of the boundaries are. An example, I think I said sort of in my opening remarks, we have one member, Hartford-based organization. It happens to be a larger health and human service provider, but they have a presence in 60 different towns. So that's beyond the 29 towns of at least the foundation's catchment area. A different organization just told, my neighbor works is the CEO of a nonprofit in Hartford, and he just told me that they entered a contract, I think in the town of Vernon, to run a mental health clinic for the school, I believe. And they're going to be deploying 2 staff full time to Vernon again, probably I think within the catchment area, but certainly a little farther down 84. So so I think it's just, I guess that segues into the next point. There really isn't a wrong door. For me at least, I feel lots of inquiries that had nothing to do with advocacy or public policy development, even though that's in my job title, from everything of how do I start a nonprofit to, legal questions to complex financial questions. If I can't find the answer to it, I'm going to find someone that can. And I think nonprofits have that same mentality. Even if they're not the right organization for that specific inquiry, to do that collaborative project, whatever it is, they'll find the person or the organization that is. And with that, there's a lot of statewide groups, whether it's, I think in the previous panel, maybe Marion mentioned, or somebody did the regional arts and cultural organizations, the designated arts and cultural organizations. I think actually maybe it was in the city of Norwich that would be the go-to to enter in those contracts. Probably Wendy is who you spoke to there. There's community action agencies, going back, I think, to what, again, the first panel mentioned in terms of basic human needs. There's 9 of them, and if that's sort of the collaborative project you're working on or the community need that we need to direct people to, start there. And then there's lots of other sort of, again, advocacy association type groups for specific sectors. And then finally, I think it's just, nonprofits want to help. I think that's how I close my first remarks. It goes a long way just to being invited to the table. And I think at least from what I've heard, feedback, at least from sort of the local ARPA processes, our members that were part of, the processes on the, grant review committees, whatever it was, they were just so happy, even if they didn't get funding, that they were part of the conversation, that they could raise awareness of the issues that they're seeing. I think it was a question from Simsbury, first selectman, that you talked about increased demand for services. They're seeing that across the board for a lot of different reasons in a lot of different communities, but being able to share that with their colleagues, see who else is at the table that wants to, try to solve these problems, address them together, really goes a long way. So I think that's sort of the three things I wanted to leave you with.
Great, great. Are there questions in the audience?
I don't need a microphone, I can project. I'm a resident of Hartford, I live in the West End, and one important factor about Hartford is that it's very compartmentalized by neighborhood. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the benefit of the neighborhood revitalization zones, and how those play a part in your choices for grant giving, and what unique problems each community faces, and how you address each one differently.
Sure. So in the city of Hartford, I believe we have 13 NRZs, the neighborhood revitalization zones, and we have been fortunate to stabilize the budget so that we're able to provide funding for the first time in years to support the work of the NRZs. They're mostly volunteers. They're not just neighborhood residents, but sometimes they can also be business owners or nonprofit agencies that are serving that particular neighborhood. I'm proud of the fact that this administration is actively participating in these meetings. So our team attends every single one of those NRZ meetings every single month, and it's not just one person. It is multiple city staff representing the police department, the fire department, the economic development department. And so we think it's really important to be just present and accessible, and be available to answer questions and try to think through, for example, what are the particular needs of a neighborhood? The needs in the west end of Hartford may be very different than the needs of the north end of Hartford. But we also recognize we have a very transient population. And so, it is not as simple as making an assumption that the west end, because it may be more affluent, right, doesn't have needs. They absolutely have needs. There are parts of the west end, right, where there are many renters, where, there are many school-age children. And so we've got to figure out a way, again, to be flexible, and we're trying to do that. But certainly we're proud of the fact that we've seen our NRZs become a lot more active, and we're hoping this additional funding that's being provided will be able to support the work that they're doing. We are actually in the process of working in partnership with the NRZs to develop a development plan, that reflects what the neighborhood's priorities are and what they want to see available in the neighborhood. Again, that hasn't been done in years. So I think we are making progress and at least headed in the right direction.
We also see the NRZs as key stakeholders and constituencies in 2 of our specific outcome areas, one of them being resident and civic engagement, us providing the resources and the capacity building and helping build platforms where the residents' voices can be lifted up, resident organizing and movement building. Also, one of our key outcomes are higher opportunity neighborhoods. So working and understanding what, and when we say higher opportunity neighborhoods, we mean neighborhoods that would be neighborhoods of choice. They have the amenities and the quality of life that we would all aspire to, whether they be, on the west end or the north end or any other part of the city of Hartford. So, in that, the NRZ stakeholders, their voice, their aspirations, their lived experiences are exceptionally important to us. So one of the things that we've done is really redoubled our efforts to make sure that we're not just sort of sitting in our offices and thinking that we're hearing or understanding the pulse, but being out in those neighborhood meetings, making sure that the residents understand that there are trying to remove all the barriers that we can for them to have access to us and the resources for us to understand, where they are prioritizing. So it also puts us in a better position to help, advance the neighborhood interests as the residents see.
Rick Porth, I just want to say thank you. It's really pretty great that we have municipal leaders, and philanthropy leaders, and nonprofit leaders together talking about how we can collaborate more on big community challenges. Just a couple words of encouragement. I was still at United Way for the first 8 or 9 months of the pandemic. And some of the lessons we learned, and this is evidence that we already work pretty well together. All three sectors. We learned during the pandemic pretty quickly that there were big issues related to food insecurity, access to health services, especially related to COVID testing and vaccinations, mental health services, which have been mentioned a few times already, and childcare at the beginning for healthcare workers and then also for frontline workers. And starting with the governor's office and his unified command, he pulled his department directors together and quickly brought in municipal emergency management folks and municipal leaders and nonprofits, and many of the funders here helped out too along the way. And I'll just say this, we did some good work together, and we began to think that this could be a model going forward, well beyond the end of the pandemic, where we could do a few things together in a more systematic way. So we learned some pretty good innovations like proactive outreach to members of our communities that we knew to have specific needs and to try to help them make a better life. Last mile delivery, especially on the food stuff. We found out innovative ways to do these things, and it wouldn't have happened if all three parts of the stool weren't working together. And then, coordinated, multifaceted focus on underserved people. These are things we learned how to do. And my hope is that we could keep doing it. And this conversation today is a way to allow us to keep thinking together about the best way to do that. So thanks for you guys that organized this. Nice work. Thanks.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts during the course of this panel. One of the questions one of the themes that I heard come up from, I think, every one of you, I want to ask you to expound a little bit on, and that is the establishment of relationships. And that's not something that can be done quickly. In terms of talking about relationships with municipal CEOs, some of us face election every 2 years, some of us face election every 4 years, and there's turnover that happens. So how are those relationships able to sustain a change in administration, or how can you accelerate the establishment of those relationships?
I think that they have to be, multifaceted, multi-layered, and that's where I alluded to the bureaucracy that sometimes gets a bad knock on it. Yes, elected officials change. That's the nature of the electoral process. So yes, while it's important to establish those relationships with the elected officials, it's also important to establish the relationships with those career officials, because frankly, they often know, where the bodies are buried. They know where the levers of power are to get something done. So in doing such, it is important. And again, I speak from my own experience of having the relationship with, whether it's the first select person or first selectman or woman or the mayor or the members of council. But it is also equally critical that I and my staff have relationships within the various layers of government, because oftentimes that's where, the decisions are, those are the individuals who often can influence, the chief elected officer of that municipality. So, I know there are times when I've tried to put a call and get in contact with someone and have been unsuccessful, and a staff member says, oh, I know so-and-so, and I'll make the call and get it done. And to me, that's what's most important, that there are multidimensional relationships all throughout various levels of government.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I've been thinking about that since day one when I started at the city, because we've created so many new programs and initiatives. I've literally, as we've gone, worked on them, I thought, where could I put this to protect it? So no matter who is CEO or mayor or COO, that this program will continue to exist, because so many times, especially in the city, there's a lot of starts and stops, and everybody wants to do their own version of the same program. We've probably had 20 different iterations up, right? And so I think one of the things that, I've tried doing is taking things out of the mayor's office as much as I can and integrating it into the operating departments, so it becomes part of an operating department. Therefore, it is not politicized, and it's somewhat protected from the politics, right, that exist. And I, certainly, programs and initiatives will start within the mayor's office or the office of the COO, but the next phase of that work is I transition into one of the, again, the operating departments, and that seems, to have worked well in ensuring that it's resourced properly and that there is a position to support that work. And again, not making this about one particular person. Oftentimes, when I first arrived in the city, there'd be somebody who was very proud of the fact, I'm the only one that knows how to do this. Well, that's not good. I mean, so how can this just be about one person? How does this become something that multiple people and multiple departments are involved in, right? I think also will increase the likelihood of it being able to sustain itself.
And I would say in a small town, we mostly know each other, but there's a consistency of town employees that are there. When the first selectman changes, almost nothing else changes. So, which is a good thing. And the community foundation staff works closely with our town employees and all the nonprofits. So it's really a collaboration. I was going to also say, one of the things with the pandemic, we discovered Zoom, and you tend to have board meetings, whether it's government meetings or foundation meetings or nonprofit meetings, and only a small group of people are there. Zoom sort of opened up the town to be able to have a lot more people collaborate and get involved. So,
yeah, absolutely, and I would agree completely with Jay. We build relationships with department heads, the social workers that have been there 20 years. This is important for us too. I mean, Kevin and I have been in our positions 5-6 years, about the same length of time. Those frontline workers know what the cultural changes have been in town over time, what families have turned over that have brought different projects to the forefront, or on an issue like mental health, like what's the reaction going to be, what's been tried and failed for a variety of reasons. So those frontline workers are, probably more important relationships for the continuity of the work, I'd say.
Well, and I think that having institutional partners like a foundation that, that really doesn't have to worry about politics, right? They're there year after year after year when they're bought into an issue too, that they can see that issue through, even as political leadership might change. I really see that as being one of the big assets philanthropy can bring, is that long-term work on a hard community challenge. So we have one more question in the back.
Hi, thank you all so much for your time. One of my questions, well, the first, it's more of a reflection. I think just thinking about everything you all shared, part of what I was thinking about is I wonder how many folks from the reentry population you all mentioned in Hartford actually might also have been experiencing either mental or behavioral health challenges, but were incarcerated at a time when perhaps the stigmatization didn't allow for that to be seen. So just wanted to note that. And I apologize because I'm more familiar with Hartford's work on this. But with that in mind, I actually wanted to ask, how are you all centering equity in your work? Because it's obvious that things aren't necessarily equal across the board, especially with respect to last summer's major movements. So how is that featuring in your work as you move forward and as you plan ahead?
I'll say that it is the central lens through which we look at all of our discretionary resources. It all flows through the lens of equity, understanding that that doesn't mean equal in the sense of all things being the same. And that's a shift that we started prior to the pandemic, probably almost 4 years ago now. And in doing such, it isn't at the expense of our broader community, but it's with the recognition that the structural disparities and inequities that have plagued this country and certainly our state and our region for so long, we are not able to ultimately achieve our mission of lifting up the entire community and creating vibrancy in the entirety of the community if we don't recognize, acknowledge, and are willing to direct our resources through the lens of equity. So it has been something that we continue to work through and work on. I can tell you that the response from our donors and from our community stakeholders has been overwhelmingly positive. There are still lessons that we learn, but it is centered, and we've even talked about it even more explicitly, that we're centering our efforts through the lens of equity, and in doing so, we believe that it is ultimately beneficial to the entirety of the community.
We actually, maybe it was 2 years ago, created the Office of Equity and Opportunity. And so Karen Taylor leads that office, and she has been working in partnership with our various department heads to figure out how do we give ourselves goals? How do we hold ourselves accountable to ensuring, for example, we are hiring Hartford